This video contains heavy spoilers for Final Fantasy XVI. Viewer discretion is advised. Every Final Fantasy fan will talk about the one Final Fantasy. You know the one. The best one. The favorite. The one that made you a lifelong fan of the series. Maybe it was 7, maybe it was 8, maybe it was 9 or 10, or maybe it was one of the classic ones like 4 or 6. Whichever one it was, if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, then you've probably been in this odd, uncomfortable place with the series, and you've been there for a while now. Every time a new Final Fantasy comes out, you think it'll be the one. No, not the one that replaces your favorite. Nothing could really ever do that. But at least it'll be the one that recaptures some of the magic that you felt with the series when it was at its peak. Something that you will remember, that you will obsess over, that sticks in your head long after you've beaten the rather long game that you played. That kind of Final Fantasy, it's been missing for years now. And while there can never truly be a consensus on something like this, I think most fans will at least agree that the last two mainline Final Fantasy games have been disappointing, to say the least. Now, it's not like Square Enix, the publisher of the series, hasn't been trying. Each successive Final Fantasy has tried to redefine the formula and tried to please both fans and get newcomers interested in the series as well. Which, of course, brings us to Final Fantasy XVI, where Square Enix put their MMORPG team, Creative Business Unit 3, at the helm of the series. And that team decided to do something interesting. They didn't just switch things up. They made Final Fantasy XVI into an action game. A third-person hack-and-slash action game that has more in common with Capcom's Devil May Cry series than anything we've seen in a Final Fantasy game. A pretty ballsy move, you gotta admit. I mean, sure, some longtime fans are definitely going to feel a bit alienated, but there's enough action game fans in the world, and maybe even in the Final Fantasy audience, that the gamble could pay off. So, does it pay off? Well, as you can imagine, it's kind of complicated. Ever since I beat Final Fantasy XVI a month or so ago, I've been really going back and forth between I like the game, I don't like the game, and there's certainly quite a bit to love. The graphics are really good, the voice acting is amazing, just the overall production values are great. Even the Devil May Cry style action combat is pretty great, and then of course there's the amazing icon battles that are truly some of the best boss battles in video games today. And all of that stuff is awesome. But then there's the other stuff. There's the fact that Final Fantasy XVI feels like it's a little too long. There's issues like the side quests being kinda MMORPG-ish, template-y, and shallow. And that there's not really a proper equipment system, or there isn't a lot of depth to the overall combat, and that it gets kind of samey after like the halfway mark or so. But honestly, those are all minor issues in the grand scheme of things. The major issue, the crux of the problem that I have with Final Fantasy XVI, the thing that it just shouldn't have gotten wrong, is the storytelling. Look, all things being equal, I think the thing that I love the most about my favorite entries in the Final Fantasy series, 8 and 9 if you're curious, is the fact that they offer really unique and very engaging stories with a really fun cast of characters that you get attached to. And that's the thing really that Final Fantasy XVI lacks, to a rather surprising degree. You see, Creative Business Unit 3 and its leader Naoki Yoshida are kind of a big deal among fans of Final Fantasy XIV. That's the MMO Final Fantasy. There's the whole story of how Creative Business Unit 3 redid and revived Final Fantasy XIV and kind of brought it back from the brink of failure. And while that story is interesting, what is most interesting about Final Fantasy XIV is the fact that fans of the game really love the storytelling. Some go as far as to say it's the best story that a Final Fantasy game has had in years. And that's why it's such a darn shame that it's the story of Final Fantasy XVI that's the weakest part of the game. Final Fantasy XVI's story feels like it just wasn't planned properly. Which is weird because prior to the release of the game, there was all this stuff in interviews about how the development team was inspired by Game of Thrones and how they wanted to evolve Final Fantasy into a more mature story, and how they wanted to make this Final Fantasy the memorable Final Fantasy, the one for a new audience. Yet none of that is actually executed on. The world of Final Fantasy XVI feels kinda like a generic high fantasy world. There's nothing truly unique like, say, 7 steampunkish industrial world or Final Fantasy VIII's modern fantasy that feels eerily close to reality, or even 9's unique fairy tale version of a fantasy world. Final Fantasy XVI doesn't exactly have something like that. What it does have is politics. The world of Final Fantasy XVI, Valisthea, is a world of dwindling resources. The main resource that the entire world revolves around is magic, which is obtained from these giant crystals that are called mother crystals. Each nation that exists in this world has one of them. And to make matters even more complex, there is a blight that's spreading throughout the land, erasing magic and life in its wake. So the nations of the world, the ones dependent on magic, are fighting to secure as much of it as they can. And at the center of this conflict for magic are the icons. Icons are what Final Fantasy XVI calls its summons. And summons in this game are a little different because they're actually a power that individuals called dominants can wield. And those individuals are looked at as major weapons of mass destruction. They're like the nuclear weapons of Final Fantasy XVI's world. So yeah, the political stuff that Final Fantasy XVI introduces in the start is engaging, even if it is a little complex. Equally engaging, maybe even more engaging, is the main character Clive, and how the story kind of puts him in a really tough spot at the beginning of the game. He loses his family, his entire family, his kingdom, and it's all a result of a betrayal from his mother, who aligns herself with a rival empire and basically sells him into slavery. He loses his brother, who is the dominant of their kingdom, and becomes an assassin for a rival kingdom where he's kind of trying to bide his time, learn what happened, and get revenge for everything that he lost. So all of this is really interesting stuff. It's really well done. So if both the political structure of the game and the main character, are really good, what is the problem? The problem is that neither of these two things actually deliver, or go anywhere for that matter. Clive's whole story about coming to terms with his own weird powers, about what he's done in his role in the death of his brother, all of that is kind of over by the first quarter of the game. And not only is it over, stuff like his brother actually being alive kind of negates a lot of the stuff that you go through, and the political stuff, that interesting, tense political situation where each nation has a resource that they want and they have a really powerful weapon that could result in mutually assured destruction. All that stuff gets thrown out. And the story switches over to the tried and true evil god has been manipulating everything from the Shadow story. That ultimately becomes a man's free will versus evil god story that any cookie cutter JRPG will feature. See, what's kind of disappointing is that for how much the interviews and pre-release PR really amped up this whole rejection of the concept of a JRPG and how Final Fantasy XVI was going to be something better, something more mature, it really just falls back into the same genre trappings that have kind of exhausted a lot of people with the series. But beyond just doing the same old at the end, I think Final Fantasy XVI is worse off than some of the things that it's been trying to reject. Yeah, a lot of JRPGs or Japanese role-playing games have a similar story template, where things start small and expand out to basically saving the entire world. But fans of the genre, at least, don't mind that stuff because they've got characters that are interesting and that make the overall story endearing and give it its emotional weight and punch. And that's the other major miss that Final Fantasy XVI makes. It's that it doesn't focus on a core cast of characters for its story. Clive, while a pretty endearing and interesting protagonist, has his whole character arc wrap up really early, a quarter of the way through the game. And then there's really no one else that is properly developed or focused on in the story. Stories can either really focus on the plot and provide a bunch of really interesting twists and turns and surprises, kind of unravel a mystery or a big revelation or something like that, or they can focus on emotional moments and focus on the characters. Really good stories will actually do both, of course. But Final Fantasy XVI can't do either one of those things. And what's sad is that the video game medium has a real potential to tell unique stories in a really unique way. In a game, you're not just a passive observer of a story. You literally drive events forward by controlling something on screen, pushing buttons, what have you. Even the most cutscene heavy games without any player choice in them can be really interesting because they have you front and center and they have you doing things in the story. The journey of getting from point A to point B is the whole focus of the story rather than events happening and you kind of absorbing them. The unique nature of video games leads to unique and interesting and different kinds of stories. Or that's the hope, at least. The problem with Final Fantasy XVI is that it doesn't do anything interesting, and it doesn't have you do anything interesting beyond the icon battles that I'm sure you've heard of by now in reviews and other videos online. And yeah, those icon battles are when Final Fantasy XVI really becomes something special, when it shines and becomes like this unique interactive piece of entertainment. But again, there's only 5 icon battles in the game, the major ones. And the last 2 are kind of not as impressive as the first 3 or so that came before. On top of that, it would have been interesting if Final Fantasy XVI had focused on these icon battles and on developing the whole game story around that. But again, the icon battles are kind of a sideshow almost in the story. And the real conflict is between this being called Ultima, who's created humans, and how he wants to use them for his own gain. And so the final conflict is Clive versus this evil god, and Clive defeats him. He removes magic from the world, and the implication is that he dies in the process. The ending feels rushed. It doesn't really dive into a satisfying epilogue, and the game as a whole ends up really kind of petering out in its final moments. It's when everything kind of slows down. The story is a little bit disappointing, the side quests get too long, the gameplay starts to feel stale, and by the end of it, disappointment settles in. And so, yeah, I guess after reflecting on this game for way too long, I guess I have to say I just was disappointed by it. I really wanted to like the game. I really wanted this action-based version of a Final Fantasy game to succeed and become the new one Final Fantasy, as I said in the beginning. I'm not sure if Final Fantasy XVI was a success. For me, it certainly wasn't, even though I did finish the game and did mostly everything in my first playthrough that I could, save for the rather bad Chronolith trials. But, I mean, even Square Enix, despite their rare public proclamation of the game being a success, have seen their stock price go down as a result of the sales of the game not reaching the high end of their expectations, whatever that means. So it's unclear if Final Fantasy XVI is indicative of the direction that the series is going to move in, or if it's just a blip, an anomaly that we get to see just this once. Honestly, I don't care if Final Fantasy is an RPG or if it's an action game. What I want, what I hope the next one has, beyond having the great graphics, the production values, the fun gameplay, is a good, memorable story and a great cast of characters. Those things are the real reason that many fans like myself fell in love with Final Fantasy in the first place. And it's the reason that despite all the fantastic stuff in Final Fantasy XVI, it just doesn't succeed in my eyes. It's not the one, no matter how much I wish it was.